Good evening, and welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. And tonight we're going to start in Matthew chapter 8. So I just spent the last few sessions going over Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And if you didn't catch those videos, I would especially encourage you to watch the last one, because I don't just finish Matthew 7, but I actually did basically an overview, a summary of the whole Sermon on the Mount, which I hope will be super helpful in understanding and being able to look at all these various components of what Jesus is teaching there, and tie them all together and kind of draw out what I believe is the core theme and principle that Christ is teaching us in that message. And so one of the things that I had said, that Jesus is making the claim that he's not introducing a new text. He's not telling the Jews who are listening, throw away your Bibles. I've come to bring you a new Bible. Nothing of the sort. Instead, he's saying you have the text, but you've misunderstood it. And now I'm going to show you what the text is saying, has always been saying. And based on that interpretation, I'm going to explain to you how one should live in light of what the scriptures teach us about who God is, who we are, and what our purpose is in the world as his followers, as his children. So I talked about that there's 2 points, right? Interpretation and then walk, like how you walk it out. And so we would expect if Jesus, if Yeshua is a good rabbi and he just gave his disciples this great teaching on what it should look like to walk out the right interpretation of Scripture, what would you expect Matthew, as one of his disciples, would tell us about next? Jesus, we should get a lot of stories of Jesus walking out practically what he just taught us on the mountaintop. And by the way, when you hear mountaintop, and when you look at the area in Galilee where this teaching probably took place, if you're thinking like big, jagged mountain, snow-capped, like just let that image fade out of your mind. It would be more in most people's, it's all relative, right? I currently live in Kansas, so what we consider mountains here isn't very big. You see a little hill and it's like, oh, there's a mountain. It's maybe not quite that bad, but it was basically a hilltop. It was a higher place. But in calling it a mountain, or at least putting that mountain language in there, I think part of the point Matthew is making is he wants us to think about another time that a man of God went up on a mountain and received teaching and came down from the mountain to deliver that teaching to God's people, right? So it's just this Moses connection, which shouldn't surprise us. Matthew being a gospel whose primary, it's a gospel written by a Jew, written to a Jewish audience. And so, of course, he wants to put little phrases like that in there to help us connect that and start thinking, Moses imagery as we are watching this story unfold with Yeshua. And so it continues then, chapter 8, verse 1, when he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. So see that he has to remind us, he went up on a mountain and then he's coming down from the mountain. Okay. And great crowds are following him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will. Be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, Show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. All right, so he's just finished his teaching. He's coming down the mountain. The crowds, and if you'll remember, initially he's drawn quite a crowd because he's already been doing a lot of healing in the region. And he uses this opportunity of seeing these crowds around him to draw his disciples in and sort of give them some public teaching while all these crowds are listening in, so they would understand who he is, what he's come to bring, what his perspective is on what the Bible teaches and what it means to live in light of that. And so these people are all following him. And as he's coming down, he sees a leper. Now, he's already said that he hasn't come to do away with Moses' teaching, that he is coming to actually live it out in a way that emphasizes the truth of the Torah, that actually demonstrates the heart behind the teachings of Moses. And so when you see a leper, what are most people thinking? What were his disciples thinking? Oh no, like, we can't go near that guy. He is unclean. And so if you're not, first we have to say, what does it mean that he was a leper? It doesn't necessarily mean the type of disease that we call leprosy today, especially in the Greek. That word could refer to a lot of different skin diseases, some of which might be a permanent disease, some of them might be temporary. I mean, things like acne could fall under that category. This guy probably wasn't suffering from just acne, but just I want to bear in mind that we don't know exactly what this guy's disease was, but only that it was something clearly visible on the skin and would have served to make this guy's life very, very miserable. And I would encourage you, I don't have time tonight to do this, it's quite long, but don't let that scare you. And maybe you'll want to do this actually after hearing this tonight. Read Leviticus chapter 13 and 14. This is where we have the bulk of the teaching from Moses on what to do about leprosy in the camp. And when you see, first of all the different types of skin diseases that would fall under this category, it's quite impressive. And then you see that, once someone had been determined that someone had a leprous disease, and they would be labeled by a priest. They had to be inspected by a priest and labeled as, yep, you've got a leprous disease, you are now unclean. And then what was required of them, having to be outside the camp, of having to basically wear a badge, in a sense, of their uncleanness, but how they kept their hair long and unkempt, how they had to wear, torn clothing, like all these visual signs so that someone who saw them from a distance could tell this is an unclean person. And then on top of that, by Jesus' day, they would have to announce if they saw someone on the road, unclean, unclean, don't come near me, don't touch me, or you'll become unclean. And there were all these rules in the Mishnah, and how the Pharisees, taught people, how to observe the law and what we do in these situations. And if you had leprosy, you had to be at least 6 feet socially distanced from someone who didn't have leprosy, unless there was wind. Then you had to be socially distanced 150 feet, and you couldn't touch anything that a leprous person had touched, and all of these things, because that state of uncleanness was contagious, and that didn't necessarily mean that, if I touch a leper, I automatically get leprosy, but that leper is unclean, and if I touch them, now I'm unclean. Now, what does that mean? It's not the same thing. Being unclean, number one, doesn't mean you're dirty, and that can be hard for us in the English language to understand the distinction there. Purity in the law of Moses and the Torah had to do with um, not bringing symbols of death, symbols of things that were contrary um, to God's character, and things that disrespected the holiness of his presence. And I'm trying to be really careful in my language because I want to do it justice. And honestly, I think the best analogy, like modern analogy I've ever heard, I actually picked up from Tim Mackey, which is, you think of today in a modern hospital. You have certain areas of the hospital where, the public are allowed, maybe not so much today with the pandemic, but okay, think about 2019 and before. There's certain areas of the hospital anybody can come in, sit down, interact with one another, the common areas. But then you have other areas of the hospital where only certain people are allowed in. And then you have certain areas of the hospital that are very, very restricted. Think like the operating room. This is a room that has to be completely sterilized and be cleaned from top to bottom. No one can come into it until they've put on certain clothes that are sterilized and cleansed. And if anything unclean were to come into the operating room, the whole room would have to be washed down and cleaned again. And anybody bringing something dirty or infected into the operating room could contaminate and infect the operating room. And for the safety of the patients who are being operated on, and the doctors themselves, there's all of these codes of dress and washing and hygiene that have to be observed to maintain the integrity of this holy space. And an operating room is a holy space. Holy just means it's unique and set apart for specific purpose. It's not common. An operating room fits that category explicitly. And so if we take that analogy and think back to then the community of God as described in Moses' teaching, and we forget this so often, that the point was that this was going to be a people that didn't just know who God was and worshiped him and had the privilege of telling others about him. They were to be a community where that God's presence was dwelling, was living in the midst with them. That God in their mobile camp with all their tents and people, there was one tent that was God's tent, and that was God's tent. Like his presence was there, and at times very visibly so. And so this was a holy place. And so there were all of these rules that reinforced the idea that God is holy. And we don't just walk into this holy space with dirty clothes, with infections, with all of these other things that symbolize death, decay, disease, all of these other things. And the point wasn't that people who are experiencing or and everybody gets dirty, right? If I touch something dead or rotten, I haven't sinned. But if I walk into an operating room, I've put people in danger, and that's wrong. And by the same token, if I'm ritually unclean, then entering into the congregation of God, of walking into the space of the temple, then I am defiling that space, and that's wrong. And so the point was never that people who were unclean were somehow excluded from God's care or concern, but there had to be a separation for the sake of the community to maintain the respect and the understanding that God's space is a holy space, and we're allowed in, but we have to observe certain rules and regulations to come into God's space. And that's what the purity rituals in a nutshell were about. There's some other things I could go into, but I'm just trying to sum it up for you. That might make a great video someday, just to talk about that. But so then lepers. So they're excluded from the community. They're excluded. This is a better way to put it. They're excluded from coming into the common area of the camp, and for sure excluded from coming into the holy area of the camp. the space around the tabernacle, the space around God's temple. What that never meant was that God doesn't care about these people. And like I said, read Leviticus 13 and 14, because there's a whole chapter on how to determine if someone has a leprous disease and therefore is unclean, and then a whole chapter about how to determine when someone has been healed of that disease, to examine them, and then once that's to declare them clean again and welcome them back in with a series of sacrifices and inspections and ritual washing that made a public statement to that person in the community that they were welcome back and could now enter back into not only the common aspects of life, but also could participate in the holy aspects as much as they were able, based on whether they were, whether they were a priest or a Levite or a regular member of one of the tribes. So, coming back now to Matthew 8 here, and this leper. So, by this point in time, if you're a leper and you have one of those types of leprosy it's chronic, you have for your whole life, then you're forever excluded from the camp. And it was almost unheard of that anyone was ever healed of leprosy. The rabbis wrote that they considered healing someone from leprosy on par with raising someone from the dead. So not going to happen. In fact, there were some teachings that the only person who had been really healed of natural leprosy, we don't count Miriam because that was a special case, Moses' sister, but the only person who was cured of natural leprosy was a Gentile, Naaman from Syria. And we didn't have any other stories of any Israelite being healed of leprosy. Therefore, it was next to impossible. Only the Messiah could heal an Israelite of leprosy. That was something that was actually being talked about in some circles in the years and days around the life of Jesus here. So this leper, in approaching Yeshua and asking to be cleansed, is in itself a statement that you must be the Messiah, and therefore you can cleanse me. And I think that's so fascinating that he doesn't say, make me healed. He says, make me clean. What's more important to this guy is not whatever the inconvenience of his skin disease, whatever that might have been. The chief issue for this man is the fact that because of this disease, because he is in a continuing state of being unclean, he is not able to participate in the spiritual life of the community of Israel. And he longs to be able to do that. He longs to be a part of the synagogue, to be able to visit the temple, all of these things that he cannot do in his unclean state. And that's what he's asking Jesus for. And notice this. Now, when Naaman the Syrian is healed, when Miriam is healed by Moses, the man of God just prays for the person and they're healed. But that's not what Yeshua does. It says, just like we saw in the beginning of Matthew 5, where it says, he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, it says, he stretched out his hand and touched him. You see, again, Matthew's using language to really exaggerate what's happening, to really make us understand the intentionality of what's happening here. He reaches out his hand and he touches. Now, what are you not supposed to do with a leper? According to Leviticus, well, you're not supposed to touch them, but Jesus touches him. Now, what's happening there? And I've heard some people, there's debate on this, of course. I've heard some people talk, well, when Jesus touches the leper, now he's unclean. Oh no, what does that mean? And other people say, well, no, when Jesus can do whatever he wants, and so he can touch unclean things, and he doesn't become unclean. And I'm not going to dive into that topic right now. And if you want to talk about that, you can join us on the live Q&A on Tuesday. And I'm happy to talk more about this if you guys want to. But what I will say is that Matthew definitely wants us to notice that Yeshua touches this man. He doesn't simply cure him, cleanse him. He does touch him. And that's significant. And I want to bring up that there is nothing in the Levitical law that says lepers cannot be touched. It simply says that when you touch them, you become unclean, and you need to go through a 6-day period of ritual cleansing. Like you just have to get over your impure. You're impure for a period of time, and then once you've seen that gone through that period of time and done the proper things, you're now then again pronounced clean. Which is a big hassle. It's a big inconvenience, and during that time, you have to separate yourself from others. You basically have to take on the inconvenience that lepers have to deal with every day. And so what that turned into practically is, well, then nobody's ever going to touch a leper, because nobody wants to be inconvenienced by being excluded from either the common or the holy life of the spiritual community. But Yeshua, who came not to abolish but to fulfill Torah, I think to him it's not, should I touch or should I not touch a leper? It's that of course we touch the leper, of course we reach out, and even regardless of what the rules, what kind of rules apply to Yeshua, for us personally, I think the commandment was never, well, so you shouldn't touch those people, they're unclean. It's just understand that when you reach out to them, there's a cost. And be willing to pay that cost in order to show love to these people, in order to be with those people. And there were some Jews who did that. I have heard recently that it's very likely that Lazarus was a leper. And so his sisters, Mary and Martha, who lived with him, likely had given up their ability to be able to participate in the religious life in Jerusalem because they were continually in a state of uncleanness in caring for and living with their brother Lazarus. And so I think there were people who got the spirit of the law, that it wasn't don't touch the hurting and the unclean, but simply understand that when you do, there's a cost involved. And so Yeshua touches him and says, I will. And the guy asked him, if you're willing, you can make me clean. He knows that the Messiah can cleanse the lepers, but what he doesn't know is if the Messiah wants to. And yet he's willing to ask. It's almost as if it's almost as if he is looking into the face of the Messiah and saying, do you love me enough to cleanse me? And Jesus' answer is, yes, I do. Be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Now what's interesting here is verse 4, Yeshua still says to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, which we might be like, what? Why does he want to keep this a secret? As we'll see, the more people hear about stories of all of these miraculous healings, the more people want to bring every sick person in a 500-mile radius, and that's all they want Jesus doing all day and night, is healing people of physical diseases. And while he clearly is willing to do that, that's not the primary purpose that he came, and he doesn't want people to become distracted by the healing, but instead understand the message that the healings are proclaiming about who he is and what he's come to do for us spiritually. But then he goes on to say nothing to no one, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. And so in other words, he's saying, like, look, still go ahead and go through with presenting yourself now to a priest. Go through there's certain offerings that had to be made, and then a shaving, and then week-long period of being under observation, and then another washing and more sacrifices, and then if still there was no sign of any leprosy, then the person was deemed clean, and then they could re-enter the normal spiritual life of the community. And so Yeshua respects all that. He doesn't say, "Oh, forget the priest." Like, he still is saying, honor the commandments, honor the instructions, but you are now healed. And we can only assume, like, his story stops there, so we can only assume that he does just that. Though in other gospel accounts we see that he didn't obey the "don't tell anyone" part and went and told a lot of people what happened. So then we have another story, a bit longer, that Matthew tells us, and he says when Yeshua had entered Capernaum, and if the Sermon on the Mount took place about where we think it did, then he was about 20 minutes walk from Capernaum. A centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." And he said to him, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion replied, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he marveled, and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from the east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And to the centurion, Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you as you have believed." And the servant was healed at that very moment. All right. So here's some things to note and observe in this story. So right on the heels of Yeshua encountering an unclean person, presumably an Israelite, a Gentile would have less reason to care about being ritually clean from someone like Yeshua. But right after that story, on the heels of that story, now I've been talking about Matthew's gospel being a gospel for outcasts, and that he's really focused on this idea that Yeshua came to invite all those that were outside, what seemed to be on the outside of the boundaries of what God was doing and his plans and purposes, that he came to invite all of these people in and to say, no, you think you're excluded, but actually God is inviting you into his kingdom, into his family. And so, right after the Sermon on the Mount, the very first practical story of Jesus living out what he's teaching is encountering such a person who would be, religiously speaking, on the outside of the spiritual community. And Jesus goes to the great length of literally touching him, to acknowledge him, to validate him, to welcome him in. And it's almost as if what we're reading now are those Beatitudes at the beginning of Matthew 5, the very beginning of that last section that we read, being played out now. Because, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Who could fit the picture more accurately of one who is poor in spirit than someone suffering from leprosy in these days? And Yeshua says, you are blessed. The favor of God is with you. The kingdom of God belongs to you. Come. And he touches him, and he cleanses him, and he receives him. Totally shocking. Would have been totally shocking to the disciples watching this, the great crowds following after him as he's coming, down the hillside towards Capernaum. And then right on the heels of that, as soon as he gets into the city, now here's a centurion, here's a Gentile, even more on the outside, a Roman, and because he's a centurion, a symbol, by his very, dress or uniform, he's a symbol of the enemy, of the Roman oppression, the occupation, all of these things. And this man comes, and he too has something that he wants from the Jewish Messiah. He has a servant that he wants to be healed. And what's shocking, is that Jesus assumes that he wants him to, come and lay hands and heal him, he shouldn't be able to go into a Gentile's home. That would also make him unclean and require a period of cleansing and all of that from being defiled by entering the home of a pig-eating Gentile. And the centurion knows this and wants to protect this Jewish rabbi from falling under coming into a state of uncleanness. He probably doesn't know that Jesus just touched a leper, and it's like, no, you don't need to do that for me. You don't have to pay that price for me of dealing with the inconvenience of becoming ritually unclean. No, just give the word. I have faith that you can just speak it and it will happen, which is like amazing, right? I mean, people are bringing their sick. We see all over Israel people bringing their sick to Jesus to be healed. But it's the Gentile that says, I don't need to bring my sick to you. If you will it, it will be. If you speak it, it will manifest. Like, wow, right? Like we're with Jesus with like, what faith is this, right? And so notice, here's where this theme of outcast, again, Matthew's just, putting it right in our face here when he says in verse 11, I tell you, many will come from the east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Now, what are Jesus's Jewish disciples hearing, and any crowds that are still following him at this point? When he says this, the message is really loud and clear. You guys, I've never seen faith like I see in this Gentile in all of Israel. And in fact, he is a model and an example of the many who are on the extreme outsides of what you guys think is God's kingdom. When he says east and west, that's clearly he's talking about the Gentile nations. And he says many Gentiles are going to come, and they are going to, and in the great feast to come, are going to sit at the fellowship table with the patriarchs. They are going to be full members of this kingdom, this family of God that he is building. The outsiders are going to be in, but there's a but in the verse 12. While the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now he talks about the outer darkness, the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. It makes it even more clear. What he's not necessarily, we often read this out and we think, oh, and all those people are going to go to hell. Not necessarily what that means. Could be. But it could also mean something a little less drastic, but still worth pondering. In most cities in Israel at this time, so you had outside the city, there would be an area, and of course there's a really famous one near Jerusalem, but many cities had this, an area where all the raw sewage would flow out to, outside the walls of the city, usually into some kind of a little valley or depressed area in the landscape. And people would also throw all their trash there. And to kind of keep the trash pile under control a bit, they would light it on fire and try to continually try to burn the trash. And so what it would end up becoming, just with the continual flow, I'm not trying to be gross, but all the raw sewage and then the burning trash, and so it's just this constant, stinky, smoldering place just outside the city. And this was where people lived who couldn't afford, like if you were wealthy, you lived inside the city if you could afford to. That was the place of the greatest protection and prosperity. If you were less well-to-do, you would live in the walls, literally in the walls of the city. You had homes that were built into the walls. And there was actually a strategic purpose in building their walls like that, because you could fill the homes with stones, and then suddenly your city walls, were 10 to 20 feet thick, which was really, really good. And then outside the city walls, if you owned land, you could have little daughter villages outside the city. But if you were the poorest of the poor, and you couldn't afford to live in the city or in the walls or even in a little village outside, and you wanted to be close to the city because of the people that were wealthy and wanting to give to the needy. That was a source of the alms, just the free gifts of some leftover sustenance, whatever. Like that is where a lot of people lived, and some people would pick through the trash to see if they could find scraps to live off of. So that was considered the lowest of the lowest place outside the city walls, and it was the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. You did not want to be one of the poor souls that made their living in the city, the burning sewage city dump. And so when Jesus is saying sons of the kingdom will be thrown into that place, what he's saying is, in a poetic way, that those people who believe they're the rightful inheritors of the messianic kingdom that is coming and is now here are actually going to find themselves that they are on the furthest place outside. So he's comparing two extremes. You think about being sons of the king is as close to the center of the city and all that the great city represents as it can possibly. These are the people that live in the palace, in the king's palace in the center of the city, right? And so it's the people that think they're the biggest insiders are actually going to find themselves the most distant outsiders. And when he says the people from the east, most the Gentiles, the people that should be the most distant outsiders, are now going to find themselves the closest insiders. I mean, they're at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's just this great flip, this great upside down kingdom from what everyone was expecting. And is that a controversial thing for him to say? Absolutely. Were people probably offended to hear him say this? Absolutely. But it's a disturbing thing, and it's a thing that we all have to stop and contemplate. That just because we think we deserve, because of what we've been taught, because of what family we were born into, whatever the reason, that we have some sort of right to be at God's table, when we lack the most basic understanding of who God is and his heart and his character and his authority. I mean, this guy, not only did he have faith, but he had faith in the authority of the Messiah. I mean, how much more through action could he declare Yeshua as Lord than in his statement there? And this guy had nothing to his name to have any claim or right to sit at Abraham's table. And yet Yeshua says, no, this guy and many, many more like him are going to enjoy that privilege. And so it's just a good check for us. Like, wow, let's not try to play games. Let's not play the name game of just because we come from a certain family or lineage or heritage that somehow that secures us anything. It is about not just what we know, but how we live and how we exercise our faith. And this is one of those passages that is very sobering for me personally whenever I read it. And so, of course, Jesus then, in saying this, he tells, hey, go, let it be done as you have believed. You have faith for it, and I say it is so. And so the servant was healed. And then, this is happening now in Capernaum, not just on a side of a mountain or hill as Jesus is coming down. And so a little bit public, and word gets around. And when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law, that is Peter's mother-in-law, lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. So exactly what, Yeshua was probably worried about if word got out that he could just heal anyone and everyone. What he was worried about happening is now happening because people can't keep quiet about this. And now everyone's bringing everyone to him, and yet he's continuing to serve them. He's continuing to take on, like, all day. And like, I can only imagine. I mean, Jesus in his human limitations physically, like just being up all day, seeing one person after another person after another person. Anyone who's done full-time ministry knows this could be like not just physically exhausting, but emotionally exhausting, especially when you're talking about people that are demonically oppressed, on top of praying over the sick, the injured, diseased, whatever, all day long. But I think we miss over when we miss when we read this. And I know I have missed this so many times over the years reading through Matthew, is that according to Matthew, what Christ was doing, what the Messiah was doing in these moments of long days and nights ministering to people who were hurting in deep, fundamental ways, spiritually, emotionally, physically, was the fulfillment of that verse in Isaiah 53. He took our diseases, or took our illnesses and bore our diseases. Often when we read that, because so much of it does have to do with Christ's ultimate sacrifice in giving up his body and body life on the cross, that we think that's all that passage in Isaiah is about, that it's achieved, it finds its full fulfillment in his death. And yet what Matthew is saying here is actually this was finding its fulfillment in his life, and how he lived, and how he interacted with the broken, with the hurting, with the ill, with the diseased. And he took that on himself. He made their burdens his burdens. He made our burdens his burdens. And so I encourage you to go back and reread Isaiah 52 and 53. Yes, seeing the foreshadowing of the cross, but also seeing the kind of life that Christ was living every day of his ministry on earth. And again, I just see all of Matthew 8 up until this point as being what it looks like when blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake. Blessed are the meek, the mourning, like all of those things, because God's favor is with you. We're seeing that now. That's a nice teaching, but what does that actually look like when it happens right in front of our eyes? This is what that looks like. And if you remember in Matthew 5, right after that, there's this shift from Yeshua talking about all those people that are hurting and suffering and in the mess, in the brokenness, to then he begins talking to them. And don't think that when you go and engage this, as I'm imploring you to do, that it's going to be without cost. It's going to cost you something, but it's worth it. It's worth it, but it's going to be hard. And you will suffer for it. But endure. It's worth it. And just so happens that the very next story there, and this will be the story we'll end with tonight, verse 18. Now, when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side, which is interesting. Yeah, well, I think I'll talk about that next week, about going over to the other side, and what that means and why that might have freaked some of his disciples out. So we'll pause there, or table that. So verse 19, and a scribe came up and said to him. Now remember, a scribe is someone who knows the Bible well, like really gets the scriptures. And obviously he's been listening to Jesus's teaching and wants to learn more, right? Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And so he tells him, okay, you can follow me, but you need to know what you're signing up for. This isn't going to be a Holiday Inn spa event. I'm not just going to be sitting under an apple tree teaching you parables all day. This is going to be difficult. And we're not told what the guy's response is. Matthew just goes straight on to another. And another of the disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. Now the second one, the first one in this section of kind of showing examples of Christ encouraging people to count the cost before they jump in the boat with him, so to speak. And that's a little bit of a joke because the very next verse next week is going to be about them getting in the boat. They got to count the cost. And the first one's really clear, right? This guy, he's enamored with the teaching. He wants to learn more. And he says he's willing to go wherever Yeshua goes. But Yeshua challenges him, are you really? Do you understand what this is going to mean? Do you understand this is going to mean sleeping outdoors on rocks? Do you understand that this is going to mean, going, having restless nights, long days, long walks? That this isn't going to be, sitting and learning at your leisure, in a school building. That makes sense to us. But then the second one, I think we struggle with without understanding the context. First of all, what is this disciple? So the first guy wants to be a disciple, but this other person is a disciple, but is asking now to be excused for a short period from following Christ so that he can bury his father. Now, it's helpful to understand that how the Jewish people understood the burial process was very countercultural to what was practiced by a lot of the other cultures around them, and even like how we treat death in a lot of places in the Western world today. The West is very much influenced by the practices of the Egyptians, believe it or not. The Egyptians were very obsessed with the preservation of the body after death, and invented really elaborate processes to embalm, to preserve, to keep that body from breaking down as much as possible. And they were so good at it that we've opened up sarcophaguses that we found in Egypt thousands of years later and found intact, not just skeletons, but skin tissue, hair, all of these things. They were really good at what they did. And there were a lot of other cultures that adapted those processes of trying to preserve the body after death. The Hebrews actually took the other went the other direction. All of those spices and things that they would cover the body with and then wrap it up in a shroud, all of that was designed to speed up the process of the breaking down and the decaying of the body. And what you wanted to do is you would put a body, after you put the right mixture of spices and oils and everything else that they would do, and you wrapped it up and you'd lay it in a tomb for about a year, if I recall correctly. And then the hope would be, if you did it right, then on the year anniversary of the person's death, you would roll away the stone, you'd go into the tomb, all you'd find left was pretty much the skeleton. All the flesh, everything else would have broken down and we've been gone. And so then you just cut through the few ligaments holding the bones together, and you would collect all the bones together in a small bone box. And then you would place the bone box in an area of the family tomb with all the other bone boxes of all of that person's family, their ancestors, and so on. And that was the family tomb. And like every culture on the planet, the Jewish people had a lot of I don't want to demean it by calling it superstition, but they had a lot of beliefs and practices. Like it was very serious that you followed all the right funeral practices, and there was a belief in some circles that if you didn't, you could affect that person's ability to enter into the afterlife. And so to not like, we don't know if this guy was. We suspect this guy probably wasn't talking like his father has just died and he needs time to mourn. What he's probably talking about is his father is currently wrapped in a shroud, his body in a tomb, and he needs to be there on the 1-year anniversary to collect his father's bones, put them in the bone box, and place them to let him rest with his fathers. And that if he doesn't do that, he could be messing up his father's chance to enter into paradise after the last day. And so it's a serious thing. And so when Yeshua says, leave the dead to bury their own dead, he's like, look, I get that that's important to you. And the fact that he wants to be excused means it's probably coming up on the 1-year anniversary. Some people misunderstand this story to think that it's talking that there's no time to mourn the dead. This guy probably has had his period of mourning. He's grieved his father's death. This is about fulfilling a custom and a burial practice that was important culturally. But what Yeshua says, it's not as important as following me right now. This is the most important place you could be, is be at my side and following me and being discipled by me. Let the dead bury their dead. Life is calling. Life is here with you now. Don't leave life to go attend to the customs of death. And I just feel like it's really important to make that clear so we don't misunderstand and think that, oh, Jesus just doesn't care about our grief. Remember, he says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That's not what this isn't about, mourning or not mourning the dead. This is about fulfilling cultural customs and obligations for the dead, when the one who's the author of life is there. The one, he's worried his father won't be raised on the last day if he doesn't go and do this. And Yeshua says, no. If you want to know who has the power to determine whether your father's raised on the last day or not, it's not whether you go and attend to his bones. It's me who's going to be able. This guy doesn't know that yet, but it's one of his disciples that says this. We don't know which one, but what he's going to later learn is it's Yeshua is the one who will raise the dead. So we'll end there. This is such good stuff, right? I think I promised last time that we were going to go and break into some of these stories and connect them back to stories from the Hebrew scriptures, from the Old Testament, and how Yeshua is bringing those stories and ideas to life in his own life. And so I'm actually going to try to do that next week. So we'll start again with verse 23, hopefully this coming Friday. But before that, I'll see you on Tuesday just to talk about the first part of Matthew chapter 8. And any questions you have or observations you make, I do encourage you to take a look at Leviticus, at least skim through it, 13 and 14, and read Isaiah 52 and 53, and meditate on the difference between seeing that all focusing on the death of Christ versus seeing actually how he was living those things out in his life up to the cross, not just on the cross. So that's my encouragement to you. So thankful for all of you who are watching this. And let me just close our time in prayer. Abba, thank you. Thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace towards us. We thank you for your word, which teaches us, instructs us, refines us, convicts us, challenges us in so many ways that we need to be challenged. Father, we ask that you would empower us to be more like you today, this week, to trust you to greater and greater degrees each day, to step out in faith, the way those we read about tonight stepped out in faith, trusting that you could do what no one else could. Help us to have that same trust. Finally, Father, I just pray for just all the things that we are burdened by, God. There's so much still conflict on the earth, things going on in the Horn of Africa, God, in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, God, other places. You know, you see it all. Father, we pray for the hurting. We pray for the broken. We pray especially for the grieving, those who have lost loved ones. You are the God of all comfort, God. Help us to find ways to tangibly love and reach out to the people in our own communities, wherever we are, to show your love and to bring your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen and amen. So, again, thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to interacting with you guys live in Q&A style this Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Time.